Hello, I'm Oriana Fox. Thank you for tuning in to Multiple O's, the spin-off podcast for my talk show, The O Show, which explores the crossover between working on the self and working to change the world. My guests include artists and other experts who expose their lives, bodies, and experiences to challenge expectations and conventions. In other words, they have skin in the game. So if you're interested in candid confessions, nonconformity, creativity, and mental health, you've come to the right place. You can find out a lot about an artist from looking at their body of work, particularly when they make art that pointedly explores the autobiographical, and especially when they work primarily with the medium of performance art, thereby making their own body central. Perhaps as a result of these facts, while I spent time exploring the work of the artist that I have the pleasure of speaking with today, I felt a little bit like a stalker. At the same time, as much as he is candidly self-exposing in his work, Robin Deacon also remains enigmatic, deflecting my easy assumptions about who he is and what makes him tick. Through his work, we find out that he has a sunny disposition, a good sense of humor, that some people think he would have been well-suited to becoming a children's TV presenter, that he grew up watching Top of the Pops with his mom on Thursdays. As a teenager, he had a record collection with only one record in it, Joy Division's 1981 Transmission. The earworms that frequently circle in his mind are jingles from the TV adverts that circulated in 1980s Britain. The only significant role he's ever had in a character-based theater production was playing the Archbishop of Canterbury in a school pageant at the age of 9. As an adult, he once inquired about becoming a lookalike for the former U.S. Secretary of State, Colin Powell. He felt he was particularly well suited for it since he, too, was mixed race and had excelled in working environments dominated by white people. That is, after graduating from art school, he was a consistent Employee of the Month at Debenhams. We also learn that he's among the biggest fans of the under-recognized performance artist and avant-garde filmmaker Stuart Sherman, that in re-performing and approximating Sherman's work, his aim was to disappear. He has a penchant for discussing himself through the lens of comparison with others. Robin's muse is memory, often filtered through the lens of the present, both literally and figuratively. Once characterized as the performer who always gets his arse out, his ass out? I don't know how to pronounce it, British or American. He's on record bemoaning the fact that insignificant aspects of his work have often diverted attention from its intended meaning. Fittingly, Robin has articulated the double anxiety predominant due to the pressures of social media, that is, of both obscurity and overexposure. Many of you also know him as the director of the International Arts Festival Spill, as a solo performer whose most frequent format is the performance lecture, as an artist born and bred in England who lived in the States for a decade, having obtained a much coveted tenured teaching position at the Art Institute of Chicago. He's a Franklin Furnace alumni and a prolific artist whose work has toured venues in the UK, US, and Europe. So without further ado, let me welcome you, Robin. Thanks so much for taking time to speak with me today. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm not too bad. That was really lovely to listen to that introduction, and you've really done your homework. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Yeah. So, what do you think has remained consistent across your work? Like, if you were to have to give an elevator pitch for yourself, what would
Lack of rehearsal. No, maybe that's not. Maybe that's not true.
Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot because that wasn't
what is consistent? I mean, I know that there's a thing about that relationship between art making and employment that I think has been quite interesting over the years. In that, even if you're, this is going back to the 1990s now. This is early work. This was I had finished my first fine art degree and went back home to live with my parents, and didn't really know what I was doing, but I thought, I'm going to be an artist now. And then I ended up working in Debenhams as a shop assistant, and thinking like, okay, what does this mean? But that experience became material for work for a performance piece called Employee of the Month. And then obviously years later in my life in working in educational institutions, those are kind of structured to sort of allow you to keep an artistic practice. But
in
you
theory,
still have to, in theory, yeah. But obviously you still have to do your bit, do your stint, and do your classes and your committees and all of that kind of thing. But still, hopefully, you can keep that in balance. And the work I'm doing now as a curator, I mean, there's ways in which, you could argue that is part of a creative process. But I think that has always been an undercurrent, I think, in all of my stuff, that there's been some relationship with work that's happening outside of the artwork that either fuels it, that either becomes in terms of subject matter or support for what you're doing, or acts as a kind of tension that where you're fighting to get your work done, right, relative to what your duties might be for your job as a teacher or whatever else. So that's certainly consistent. That's certainly consistent, and all of the stuff that you talked about in your opening summary of my work around a certain kind of difficulty in placing me in terms of a position or whatever else. And I don't know if
because you use irony and satire, and especially in that Colin Powell piece, it's really hard to. I mean, I think I know where you stand, but it's all really tenuous, and it's all very humorous, and you sort of don't know where.
Absolutely. There's something about
you don't really know where your political views lie from watching it. You kind of think maybe you do, but
yeah.
Not really.
But at the same time, I think that I guess it's the question of if I was a musician, would I be doing protest songs like Bob Dylan, or would I be doing something that, I don't know, it's about whether you want to be very, very direct about things, or whether you want to take a more circuitous route around things. And I'm interested in grey areas and ambivalences about things. I don't think that we need sort of shy away from those things. And I think I don't endorse that as a way of approaching things that other artists should adopt. I think some of my favourite artists are very, very direct and with their politics, or with their sense of presenting their true self or whatever else. But for me, there is just something about that being a more wanting there to be more than one interpretation, maybe, and I just giving somebody something to think about, that gives them something to question, rather than this was my definitive position on something, end of. I don't personally know how interesting I find that as a maker to for that to be my work,
Yeah, so it's more about your kind of aversion to this sort of direct confessional, a more confessional direct approach is actually about making it, as opposed to being read.
I think it's. I think it's broader than that. Just anecdotally, I was doing. I did this really lovely residency in at McDowell, which is this really beautiful residency place in New Hampshire in the US, and I had a really, really lovely time there. And I remember doing a little sharing on some of the things that I was working on, which included an account of my that's related to my mum's life. And my mum was born in Trinidad and moved to the UK in the 1960s. But before she, in her life in Trinidad, she was a singer. She was in a group, in a kind of like a folk group. And I managed to find a record of hers, and she's on the cover. It was just, and
cool.
I did this. This is an element of a performance piece I was working on, and I played this, and I presented this lecture to them, but what I wouldn't do was play the record, and I remember people were really kind of quite. I was going to say shocked or annoyed. It wasn't that extreme, but they were like, "Well, why wouldn't you? Why can't we hear the record?" And that was the whole. It was this withholding, I guess. And I just remember that conversation quite distinctly, where I was trying to explain to a room of mostly American people, and again, maybe this is a Britishness thing, where I felt like, well, playing the record, well, that would be too easy, wouldn't it? That would just give you what you want, and I don't necessarily want to give you what you want in this instance. And so I think there's something about that. This not just being about political views, but also giving you those kind of more predictable emotional peaks or whatever that you would want in a piece that you would expect. And so it's about expectation, I suppose. I mean, this maybe comes from that art school education I had that introduced me in the 90s to performance art as distinct from acting. And acting, in that sense, that I was taught was manipulative, and it was about people taking on characters that weren't real and then repeating the same lines every night that seemed to be infused with emotion but were really not. Yeah. And the performance artist is doing something for real, all of that kind of stuff. And so I think maybe there's some roots of it in that, but at the same time, I'm a lover of cinema and as a form, and that all kinds of cinema, but very narrative, straight cinema in some ways. And so that is me as a consumer. But then if you turn that round, it becomes in terms of what I'm putting out to the world. Look, there was also this kind of sense of when I was at art school and learning about performance. Again, this was not in a kind of conservatoire kind of context. It was like
art school.
Yeah, and so performers who didn't quite know, people who were interested in performance, who didn't have acting skills. It was just, I'm just going to do this, and sometimes it was really fascinating, and sometimes it was awful. And in the years I learned the years I was teaching, this is a little nugget that anyone who's heard me speaking publicly, I will often say this when I summarise my experience of teaching over the years. I taught in art schools, and I taught art students and theatre students. The art students had all the ideas, but no technique, and the theatre students had the technique but no ideas. And I think right. In the earlier days of teaching, I was quite a kind of, I'd be going in there and proselytising about performance art. No, this is where it's at. But then as time went on, I was more interested in this artist has some really good ideas, but they can't project. And it would be really good if they could, so I could hear that really fascinating piece of writing that they've done. Or if there was an acting student who couldn't really function without a character or motivation, but if you talk to them about their lives, if you wrote a monologue about that experience or who you were, that would be really fascinating if you were presenting that as you. And I was like, as I kind of got deeper into my teaching career, it was like, well, can't we meet in the middle with this? Could we find some way that performance art, live art, whatever you want to call it, was not viewed as anti-theatre, that you could take interesting elements from both and find something in the middle. I think that's maybe happened more in recent years. I think that there's a certain kind of performance I see that is maybe a little more polished, I guess, and it's maybe it's not just about polish. Yeah, I'm not sure how to articulate this, but I think it was more on this thing
veering
of what
more
you...
towards theatre than...
Well, I don't know. No, it's veering more towards what works, and
Right.
in both of those areas, in both of those things, and not, like, so the analogy or the point of reference I would often use when I was introducing theatre and acting students to more experimental forms of performance was, you have a singer like Celine Dion who has this sort of like that's trained and perfect, but you also have a singer like, I don't know, Bob Dylan or whatever, where the voice is, or Leonard Cohen, or I don't know, where a voice is not great but somehow hits you in a certain way that is delightful, but is not about technique necessarily, and
Right.
that skill and technique were not always the answer. I think that was kind of what I was trying to get at. But even within that model, something can still be shit. That can be irredeemably bad. and to understand that, and you can't just say, oh, that's performance art or that's a work in progress. It's like, well, no, I mean, I'd rather see a good piece of theatre than a bad piece of performance art. I mean, that would be my feeling, but I'm interested in both, I guess.
Yeah.
That's my kind of annoying centrist kind of
That kind of-
non-partisan
yeah.
answer to the
That makes
theatre performance divide. Yeah.
And kind of segues nicely to talking about like your approximation of Stuart Sherman's work, because he did his Hamlet, which is very much about that kind of dialogue between theatre and more avant-garde forms of performance art.
Absolutely, but this is not Hamlet as we would know it. That's
right.
That's the interesting thing. And I mean, just to preface it, I met Stuart Sherman as a student again in the mid 1990s, and this was at Cardiff. What was the University of Wales Institute of Cardiff? That at that time had a very, very interesting strand of performance, a performance program, the time-based studies department. And the person who taught there when I was there was Anthony Howell, who was very, very interesting sort of formalist approach to performance, but within that you could apply some of his techniques to your own sort of concerns and interests, and it was really, I remember he kind of shared some really interesting techniques for structuring your ideas, and you could, and they formed a vessel in which you could kind of pour in any content, and something kind of interesting would happen. And so Stuart Sherman came into the time-based department just as a visiting artist, and I remember he was very well known for these little performances where he'd stand in front of a table and move objects around, and again, that's in the simplest kind of description. There was much more to it there, but it was very, very funny, and I always said it made me laugh, but I didn't really know why I was laughing. It was very quick, it was very short, so it was an antidote to some of that kind of more cliched image of performance art of long durational work, 3 hours and nudity and stuff. So it was short and funny, and I didn't really know why I found it funny. So and if you look at, I've talking about old work, very young work as a student, if you were looking through videotapes of my very, very early work in the early to mid 90s, and you can see this kind of like, you could probably find, oh, this is where he met Stuart Sherman, and all of my work for a period becomes me with little objects moving things around on tables. So I kind of really held on to that. That was this first artist that I thought, oh my God, what is that? I want to do stuff like that. And there's other examples of people I met over the years. And then years and years and years later, he passed away around 2001. And
just after 9/11.
Exactly. And some people who I've talked to around that said that there was an additional element of sadness because they felt like his passing was just not registered in a certain way. But he all those years later, I was thinking a lot about his work and what happened to him, and the sense that his work was kind of disappearing in some way and wasn't really being talked about anymore. But he was such an influence that I wanted to try and do something about that. So I made these reenactments of his work, his solo work, and his ensemble work, like you said, that version of Hamlet that he did. And I did a 90-minute documentary film, and this is it's nice to talk about this again because it's the work that I feel most proud of, and really, I think it was the work that I feel like it's quite profoundly, that it was a special thing to work on, and a special time as well. Because I think his work was really important to me, and I think it was important for his work to be seen, and it felt like it was part of a bigger charge. It wasn't just me doing this; there are other people working on gallery exhibitions and writing on his work who did a lot of amazing stuff to bring his work back into sort of people's consciousness. But you would ask in the context of the Hamlet piece, it was Stuart Sherman's Hamlet was like 20 minutes in length. I think it had like
many actors,
many
performers.
Relatively, it was like 7 people in it, and like they were holding.
That was props it. And
a lot of props, and they had, and I think 5 of the performers were holding little portable cassette players, which had recordings of a version of Hamlet, maybe Laurence Olivier doing it, and they were all playing them simultaneously, so it was all this cacophony of voices. And I remember working on the reenactment. That was my favourite bit, when all of these voices of Hamlet and I remember in the Q&A somebody asking me if I'd ever a more direct question around the relationship of his version to the more traditional versions of Hamlet, and I said, well, I've never read Hamlet, and they were incredibly shocked at that fact that I hadn't done my homework to that degree. But it was that whole project over the years, the film, the reenactments. But
conversely, you made all the set and yourself, and that was about making you seem to be very proud of having made all that with your hands.
If I look back on it now, it was a really crazy process, and I did all of this stuff by hand, and was doing all-nighters building these enormous sets. And even the rehearsal in the ensemble context again was quite minimal ultimately, but I pulled it off. But it was, if I look back again, this was around 2010, so not so long. So that's more like 15 years ago, and I think of that way of working, I couldn't do that now, or it doesn't appeal quite in the same way. It was kind of quite crazed in terms of that approach to working, and I don't really have that same desire. But Stuart Sherman,
you'd rather not pull all-nighters, or
no, I can't. I'm early. I'm a much earlier to bed these days. But Stuart Sherman was a very, very, very interesting artist. I mean, I felt like, and maybe it was in that context of views of performance that were very much more visceral, I guess. And I think his work had this kind of thinky. They were like little cryptic crosswords. I always viewed his work as being a bit like a cryptic crossword. And there was something about that really... one of the people I interviewed kind of made this... Richard Foreman, theatre director Richard Foreman, I interviewed him for the documentary film. And he said something about having... his interest in Stuart Sherman's work was this kind of cerebral clarity, was the phrase he used, but there was also this kind of strange sort of fumbling, trembling body within that, and he loved the interplay between those things. But for me, it was also about this kind of reenactment, the transcription. So there was a real emotional thing to it of like, yeah, I'm on a mission to, reintroduce Stuart Sherman to the world that's forgotten him. But I had a lot of fun just sitting and watching these videos and transcribing them and working on them. And in a way, the fact that I talked about an aversion to rehearsal. Maybe that was less of an issue because you kind of had something that you were trying to, that you had
gives you like a list and props and you can just follow it.
Totally, it was it was a much clearer point of reference. And I know you had also, I know you'd referred to a few of these other people who've worked with reenactment.
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't even realize the synchronicity of the timing, like 2010. Like, I did my Once More with Feeling about women's performance art in 2009, and Clifford Owens did his anthology in 2010 as well. I'm not sure when Tanya Bruguera was reenacting Ana Mendieta's work, but I think it's similar timing. Yeah. So it's just kind of interesting, all these projects around reenactment and like recognizing figures who potentially could be lost to history or lesser recognized.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think I kind of came, I don't know, I kind of came back to these things more in retrospect maybe. And I think I'd sometimes, if I was doing talks about the reenactment elements of Stuart Sherman's work, then 7 Easy Pieces by Marina Abramovich was always a kind of useful point of reference, and that that she was focusing on this more canonical stuff, and I was sort of trying to focus on this body of work of this sort of less, a more obscure artist. And another reenactment piece I really liked was Jeremy Deller's Battle of Orgreave because of the scale of it and what it was reenacting. It wasn't reenacting an art piece; it was reenacting this incredibly important tipping point in UK political, the UK history. And there was something about that I was really fascinated by. Yeah, you're right. There did seem to be a particular kind of period of time where a lot of artists were exploring this and really thinking about, okay, what kind of work are we talking about? And bodies of work, individual artists who may have been missed, and the fact that often performance artists are the ones who kind of fall between the cracks because if they're not properly documented or for whatever reason. So yeah, it was. I think we could definitely see it as part of that bigger focus that many artists were looking at that time. When I was working on the Stuart Sherman project, I remember interviewing someone for the film who we were talking about Stuart Sherman as part of the kind of downtown scene, the downtown New York scene. Bunch of artists who were working in New York in the late 1970s, and something interesting was sort of happening in that city at that time, experimental performance, film and music and so on. And this person was saying, well, I didn't know I was part of the scene, of the downtown scene. I was just doing it. I was just making my work. And then the categorization of that work as being part of a scene or collectively understood kind of came later. That was kind of almost imposed on it in it subsequently. And then I think around a bunch of artists in the when I was in the mid 2000s maybe, the live art scene in the UK and so on, and how again, those categorizations are made maybe more in retrospect, and then that's when you see, sometimes kind of people can drop off the map for whatever reason. I think there can be multiple reasons for that. There can potentially even be sort of self-sabotage of that. Maybe I don't know.
Which kind of leads to that concept you have of the submerging artist.
Yeah.
Could you say a bit about the submerging artist? And
I'm trying to remember. You see, this is the thing. I don't know if I came up with that phrase or someone else did, and I just ran with it. I think I did, but I just don't know. I think there's this. It's just to sort of summarise it very obviously. We all understand. If I say emerging artist, we understand that person who might be early in their career and is making interesting work that people are latching onto and seem to be the hot new or next thing. All of that kind of thing. And then you'll have these people who are maybe a few years on, who have maybe gone through that, are still working, but maybe aren't, well, but by definition aren't new anymore, because you're still around, you're still doing your thing. And then that sense that people may have, that they feel as though they're not part of that, they're not being asked to do stuff in the same way as they did when they were younger, which I think in some ways is really, really understandable. But I think there's a way in which that can be taken really personally. But there's also ways in which, you know, people will just like, well, you know, obviously people move on and do different things, or make space for younger artists to come through. But there was certainly a sense of, when I remember talking to people about this idea, this phrase, the submerging artist, that people, you know, kind of recognised it, you know, did sort of understand that feeling of like, oh, I don't get asked to do stuff as much as I might have done in the past. And I think my own relationship with this, I've got to be, you know, I think you also have to be incredibly careful, because it could also come off as incredibly whiny and self-regarding. I've been very lucky, because I think I have worked in these educational institutions that have kind of supported my practice as an artist, and even when it's not been within an educational institution, it's been work that has sort of been stimulating or creative in some way. I think there's something to be said for longevity, of just beavering away, of just sort of getting on with it and trying to. That's certainly been my approach. That I've never really stopped. Yeah, there's something about, if you don't think about what you're doing so hard and you're just kind of ticking over, you can kind of almost unconsciously have a body of work that you've done without really even thinking so hard about it. Because like when you're a younger artist, it's so much about visibility. It's so much about, you know, having your work proliferating and being out there. And I look at how much I was doing when I was a younger artist, about like 20-30 performances a year, and sometimes they were like different performances each time, and all of this kind of stuff. And not you know, I don't have the energy or interest in working in that kind of way anymore. And I think what was nice when I started working on the Stuart Sherman piece was everything kind of slowed down and became about that project, and it had a much longer gestation period. It was like these 5-year gestation to sort of from beginning to end with that film. And I was so proud of what I produced. And the kind of way that I work now in this kind of submerging sense is kind of, there's long held interests that I have, that I'm just sort of constantly running in the background. And sometimes these will have some public outlet. So I performed at the Norfolk and Norwich Festival this year, this piece around memories of watching television. I mean, you had mentioned this at the beginning. And I'm doing the same piece at Colchester Arts Centre in a few weeks' time. And so,
plug.
yeah, come along. But it's just I'm still sort of carrying on with that stuff, and there's maybe a little more pleasure in doing that when it's detached from this kind of rat race, I guess, or this feeling of this desire to be seen always. And in some ways, like I'm thinking more about when you're thinking less in careerist terms, it is more fun because it kind of matters a bit less, maybe, and I can have maybe a bit more fun with things, or maybe just there's less of that kind of desperation with it, and you know. The world it's a very, very different place. It's not the mid-2000s anymore, and I think I've kind of figured that out. And there's things that I'm really still interested in as an artist that I'm happy to carry on doing. And you know, more writing these days as well. I still really enjoy that, but yeah, I'm maybe in answering that I'm kind of questioning. I think I have to be careful in terms of how I talk about that phrase submerging artist, because maybe it's not, because submerging kind of implies drowning and disappearing at the bottom of some deep lake and your body never to be found again, or dragged or dredged out of the water later on, and you know. But maybe it isn't just that. Maybe there's an interpretation of the submerging artist which is sort of settling into a rhythm that is a little more pleasurable in some way, and not so much about spin maybe,
because I think you've written about it as like, or you've written about like being a 40-something teacher in you know, with young people, and asking them what do they think about the idea of like an older artist being discovered, or like I don't know, and they were like I don't know, you just feel like, and they were like, no, you know, kind of thing, like, oh, we're only interested in young people. Like, you're old, you're ancient.
But
of course,
again,
kind of
yeah,
thing. Like,
I know, but you know, and again, in terms of talking to students about aging, that was always really interesting to me, because I think a lot of the students don't that I was dealing with in their early 20s just didn't really. I thought kind of being 30 was old to them. Being in your late 20s was like old, and so there's a broader thing about aging and physical capacity, the ability to do things. And I look back at videotapes of just some of the weird stuff I was doing, throwing my body around and getting into all sorts of stuff in my earlier careers as an artist in my 20s, and you know, couldn't imagine myself doing that now, or being able to do that now in the same way. So that's fine. I don't yearn for that. But the sense of, like, you know, artists being kind of discovered late on. I know that you have people like, you know, Louise Bourgeois. You know, some of these people came to a certain form of success later on. I mean, you know, the fact of that often being a situation with women artists, I think that's a whole other discussion. But I do like the idea of reinvention. When I talk to my students about this, I would talk about the musician Scott Walker, who was in the Walker Brothers in the 1960s, who are like this sort of boy band of the 1960s, who were kind of bigger than the Beatles at a certain point. And,
really?
you know, The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore, that's a really beautiful song of theirs, and Make It Easy on Yourself. And Scott Walker has this beautiful baritone voice. And, you know, anyway, their star burned very brightly and then collapsed inwards. And then kind of Scott Walker kind of disappeared, and then many years later came back with making this, in his 60s and 70s, making this indescribably weird music, and releasing an album every 10 years. He passed away a few years ago now, but I always thought that was a sort of really interesting comparison for my students to think about, of seeing. There was a wonderful documentary about Scott Walker's life, where you would see this footage of him. There's this beautiful, handsome, chiseled young man with this golden voice in the 1960s, and then footage of the sessions for this album he was making. I mean, I don't know what year this would have been, maybe the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, where he's using a kind of side of meat as a percussion instrument. It's just nuts. His later music, it's bonkers, out of this world, but this incredible transformation. So I think aging can kind of offer that in some way, and that idea of, it's not even about then re-emerging, like the idea of it's just maybe when you're submerging, you drag everyone down with you to that darker, weird place that Scott Walker was in. So I'm kind of really building on this concept, you know. But yeah, it's interesting.
But yeah, I mean, in a way that, like, you could describe his career as a disœuvre, like a musical disœuvre, like, to use Felicity Allen's phrase. But obviously she came up with that term because to describe, like, how women artists, you know, their careers often get are interrupted by, you know, domestic, you know, commitments or, you know, having to take on full-time work or whatever it is. So I wanted to ask you whether you identified with that term at all, and if you saw, and part of the term as she defines it is that, like, the work done in other contexts, not in the studio or the theater or wherever it is, could be considered part of the artist's work. So your teaching or your curation. I was wondering whether you think of that as your work.
I think it depends how you. There's maybe a view of an artist where we imagine that they do their best work when they are kind of isolated from the kind of that kind of everyday life stuff, that thing of having the jobs and all of that sort of stuff, and they can just follow their muse or whatever or whatever they want to do. And I'm not saying that wouldn't be wonderful if I never had to work another job again in my life. That would be nice. I mean, who wouldn't not want to work? But at the same time, I'm grateful that having work, having employment has kept me connected, I think, to the world in a certain way. There's certain kind of skill sets that I think completely overlap. This is a well-worn Robin Deacon anecdote of the student in my early days teaching when I was at London South Bank University for quite a few years, who I was doing a performance and I was inviting the students. Can't remember which performance it was. It might have been Colin Powell. I don't know. And one of you said, "So what's your work like, Robin? What is it that you do?" And I said, "Well, you know, I will stand on a stage. It's just me being me. I'll talk. I've got some notes. I'll have some slides and videos going on in the background, and that's kind of it." And so that's like what you do with us in the classroom. It's like,
right?
Yeah, I guess so. So in some ways it was, you know, the performance lecture stuff. You know, those were similar muscles being used, and maybe that was just a completely pragmatic decision, you know, because it was like a way of doing both kind of methods of a singular method of performance in both contexts. That might have been that. But I think it's a question of balance primarily, though. I think that is. I remember the last kind of the teaching job I had in Chicago, I did experience having a sabbatical. And, you know, it's strange if you teach in the UK educational system, and I say this, every 6 years you get a year off paid. I mean, it's sort of like, how is that possible? And I was in America long enough to experience what that was like and to return to the studio. And I do remember coming back off, having finished that sabbatical and having to come back into work and having to come back into the classroom was really, really bloody hard. And it was, but I also remember around that time calling home to speak to my brother, who works in British healthcare, and complaining to him about how hard it is. I've just had a year off. I've got to go back to work, and then just my brother just telling me what his week had just been like, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'm going to check my privilege here, as that phrase will often remind me to do. But yeah, I can't remember what the question was now, but I don't know where I've gone with
whether you considered your teaching. Well, no, it was a good answer, but yeah, what about curating? Do you consider that your work?
I mean, I'm still that's a harder one to figure out, because I think I'm working with Spill for just it's 3.5 years, just over 3.5 years, and so that's probably a harder one to figure out. I think that's a very, very different context, and I think it's taken me a while to sort of find my feet in that, because I came from academia, and it's a different kind of field. But I think there are ways in which you can certainly flex your creative muscles in a curatorial context, absolutely. But you're in a scenario of British publicly funded art, and that's a tough landscape at the moment with what's possible, certainly financially, so, but there's the work need not be in opposition, and I think there are little techniques and ways and means of getting those things to function alongside each other, or in symbiosis, or just feeding each other. But the context is important. It doesn't always work, but there are ways that it can. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What's the longest gap you've gone of not making anything in your life?
Ooh.
Since you started.
Oh God, I mean, it depends. You could argue.
You've been really prolific. I think.
Thank you. I mean, that's nice to hear. I mean, you could say that you're always working away at something. There's always something going on. There's always something cooking. So there's that way of thinking about it, and a lot of those periods of downtime are kind of. I mean, I have sometimes had these strange experiences where I'll work on something frantically and then hit a wall with it and not really know what I'm doing, and then put it away and not really think about it, and then come back to it a few weeks or months later, or even years later, and what you were grappling with, you immediately have the solution to. Now, either that's just what happens when you just step away from something, give it a bit of time, and then go back in, or that is what I sometimes think in my sort of romantic view of how an artist works. Like, that's somehow there's been some thing going on in the background that my mind is independently working out this creative solution that I couldn't figure out, and that's just going on in the background that I'm not even conscious of. And so that sense of something always going on, but I don't think I've ever stopped. I don't think there's always a thought process. That never ends, and sometimes that isn't always good, because sometimes you do want a break from thinking about stuff. But I think the thought process has definitely shifted and evolved over the years. It's like I say, I'm at a very, very different stage as an artist, and that desire to always be showing or feeling like if I'm not making, I'm gonna not be anymore, or the feeling that if this might be the last time I ever show my work, I don't think I worry so much about that anymore.
That's good.
I guess I can't worry about it anymore in the same way that I think there's still things I want to do.
So what age did you reach this kind of solace about that? Because I'm like, maybe just a few years down the line for me. Because I'm 46. And I'm like, maybe just soon I'll feel that way too.
I mean, I'm 51. And so, maybe you got me on a good day as well. Maybe there'll be other there'll be other times where if you'd spoken to me, I don't know, a month ago, I don't know, I might have been like, oh my god, what am I doing? Where was my artistic career? But it's just like I don't know. Again, maybe this is sort of me kind of just wanting not to be.
Not to be windy.
Yeah, and not to be too predictable in a response, because I think there are there are good. But again, there's maybe days where you feel a little more of an itch to be doing something, but you don't have the time or capacity or context to do it. And there's other times where, like, okay, there's stuff that's just ticking over, and yeah, it'll find an outlet in some way. There was something about the Stuart Sherman project, and curatorially fast forwarding to now, that has made me think about an interest. I've always maybe been interested in artists that mean a great deal to very few people. And I think that Stuart Sherman had that vibe to him. And then, some of the artists I've been working with recently have similar kind of models of engagement, which aren't about filling a theatre and selling out a show, And it was like the point of reference. Again, this might be a bit of a well-worn, I don't know, is it a cliche? But that thing that said
deaconism.
No, this isn't a deaconism. This is a more general. Okay. This is a more general thing. That thing that said about hardly anybody bought the Velvet Underground's records when they came out, but everybody who did formed a band. So and people have said that. I think people have switched out Velvet Underground for other bands or whatever. But just that idea of those few people who bought that record felt inclined to form a band of their own because it meant that much to them. And there's maybe, I know one of your questions about defining success, and again, maybe that's kind of that kind of shift of what it's not so much the amount of people who engage with what you do, but the level of meaning or connection that you might have. And I think that's taken on maybe an increasing importance. That I'm not even necessarily talking about me as an artist, but I'm interested in that kind of art or that kind of working, because there's something about that I think could be really fulfilling. And I think
that's so refreshing, because I just haven't heard that before. That seems really like I don't know. I hadn't actually. Yeah, I feel like I haven't encountered anyone saying that to me as their definition of success. I think it's really cool. I like
what was
that.
It? That's lovely, but there's variations. There's variations on this. There's a this Scottish musician who was quite active as a indie artist in the 2000s, I guess. His name's Momus, and he's also a very interesting writer as well. And he came up with this phrase about being famous for 15 people, which I thought was a lovely kind of, it's a similar, it's so adjacent, good. I think, to that idea of work meaning a great deal for a smaller number of people. But he's got some interesting stuff to say around that.
Because I've heard of variation is just like, I know of people who are like, I don't care about, having an art career. I'd rather be creative for my family. Like, I'd rather do creative things that my family, my people closest to me appreciate. Yeah. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting, and like, that's so different from my, like, my own ambitions as an artist. But I'm like, oh, that's interesting that some people feel that way. And no, this is like it's a different variant on that. It's strangers, but it's still a kind of intimate gathering of people who really, really deeply appreciate you. But I feel concerned about like the length of our conversation. I'm happy that
can I just say
wanted to be this generous.
So I'll say one more. There was one more. Okay. You'd asked one question about the favouring of ironic humour and satire in your work, and if you've ever strayed from it. And I thought that was I thought it was a really super interesting question. I was thinking about the video. I don't know if you saw the video that I'd done about my dog dying
Yes,
and there was something about that really, I felt like that really broke a pattern in terms of how I approached that, and I think that was the one that my mind immediately went to, and it was the one piece that I felt like probably is quite standalone in terms of how it, and I mean, again, it was quite a, it felt like an outlet of something, and it was, that just occurred to me.
Yeah, because I was wary of like mischaracterizing, like by saying you do mostly humorous satire, right? Because it's not all. I definitely don't think it's all. Ironic and satirical or humorous. Like there's definitely more like different affects, I guess, or across the work. The dog piece made me think about the fact that parents buy their kids pets to like get them used to the idea of death, or kind of prepares them for like if a grandparent might pass away or something. I was thinking about that, and I couldn't help but think about that with that, and then knowing you came back to the UK because you COVID and wanting to be closer to your parents as they got older and stuff.
I mean, all of those things. I mean, it's probably. Yeah, talking about that piece, that was probably another hour to add. So maybe we can't go there with that, because it's a very very complicated piece to unpack, and then it does open up some of these questions around questions of mortality. I mean, in a way, like the piece I was talking about of my mum and the vinyl record, and like her voice being on that record. I think there's something about preempting loss that kind of comes with that, of thinking about this is an object that like I will still have. I mean, we're all going to die at some point, but we'll leave these things behind, these recordings of our voices, these images of ourselves. And same thing that, and again in the spirit of my going at things at a funny angle, I'm gonna do a short video about my dog passing away that doesn't involve showing any images of said pet, rather showing images of hard drives and SD cards that are the objects that contain images of him. So again.
And what's interesting though, like the image that I think of when I think of the piece, I think of the dog's eyes, because you describe like the dog's eyes being open when the dog passed away, and being surprised by that. So that's the image that like sticks with me. So again, it was again another example of, I think hardly anybody has seen that work. It was done for a obscure online Finnish live art magazine, and it's there on their channel. It's on my Vimeo, and hey, that's absolutely fine. But I think it is that thing about, there's that kind of personal element to it that does feel more appropriate, that's not in circulation to that wider degree. But it is potentially out there for that. Sure,
but at the same time, it's like, again, even within that piece that's personal, if I'm citing that as something that breaks a pattern, there's still stuff that's personal to that experience that I and my wife had, in terms of that loss, and that I used to talk to my students in the same way, who would. Performance tends towards people revealing things about themselves, particularly when people are first exploring it as a medium. And I would always have those conversations with students who were really revealing autobiographical things about themselves, but were also expressing an ambivalence about that, and saying, my work's about revealing. I said, no, but you have to balance out. Think about your work being about privacy and what you choose. Start from a place of privacy and figure out what you don't want to reveal, and then go for it. But students would often not have figured that out, and splurge it all out, and then regret.
good advice.
Yes.
Such good advice.
Yeah. So, and it was just, and then they'd be regretting, why did I say that? Why did I say that? And it's like, well, you said it. I mean, you've got to think about, just plan that out and risk assess what you're doing. And I think that was like, you think about your work as being about privacy. And I thought that's certainly how that might also be what we were talking about earlier, in terms of an approach to work that seems kind of oblique or indirect or enigmatic in some way, in terms of how you place my position emotionally, politically, or whatever else. I think it's important that we hold on to those things, and it's harder to do now, I guess. Yeah.
That is so good. That is like a perfect point to for multiple O's and for the O show. Kind of that is what the series is all about. Is like these questions of like what to reveal, what not to reveal, and how you make those decisions, and then how actually making that kind of work then impacts your actual life. So that's like great to touch on that.
Yeah. It's lovely to talk about the work, but also in that kind of framed in the broader thing that I think the O show's doing, in terms of talking about artists who are working with autobiography, self as subject, and all of that, and being kind of part of that wider discourse it's nice to be part of that broader conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and
all right.
saying yes. Thanks for listening. Thanks for getting to this point in this episode to hear me say, I hope you will accept yourselves unconditionally, your lives and other people, because we're all just fallible human beings.